You traded my island for a chair in Parliament? Duchess Margaret Harrow's question cut through the library with such precision that even Lord Vale's secretary stopped arranging the documents. Duke Sebastian Harrow stood behind his desk, one hand resting beside the open deed of transfer. He did not deny it. The island has been poorly used for years, he said. Vale can develop the harbor, and his support will give this family influence where it matters. This family? Margaret repeated. You mean yourself. The two solicitors lowered their eyes. Rainwater tapped against the tall windows, but the room smelled of hot wax and fresh ink, the unmistakable scent of a decision already made. Margaret looked down at the deed. Gullhaven Island, its lighthouse, harbor, cottages, salt warehouses, fishing rights, and surrounding waters had been transferred to Lord Nathaniel Vale for a sum so small that no honest sale could explain it. In return, Vale had promised to support Sebastian's nomination for a seat in Parliament. The island had belonged to Margaret's father. He had taught her to read the sea there, the movement of tides across Blackthorn Reef, the meaning of foam around submerged stone, and the subtle difference between a safe current and a deadly one. After his death, Margaret had maintained the charts, repaired the lighthouse, and used the harbor income to support 30 fishing families. Sebastian knew all of that. You had no right to sell it without consulting me. As your husband, I have every right to manage property attached to this marriage. My settlement protects Gullhaven. Sebastian's expression tightened. Your settlement contains language open to interpretation. Margaret turned toward Mr. Alden, the older solicitor who had handled her father's estate. A pulse moved visibly in the man's temple. Is that your interpretation? She asked. Before he could answer, Vale's secretary slid a second document across the desk. His Grace requires only your acknowledgement, Your Grace. The transfer itself is complete. Margaret did not touch the pen. Sebastian came around the desk. For a moment, she remembered another man, the young Duke who had once spent an entire night beside her at the lighthouse, holding a lantern while she corrected a dangerous error in a naval chart. He had admired the mind he now treated as an inconvenience. Do not make a spectacle of this, he said quietly. You invited witnesses to protect us both. No, you invited them so my humiliation would have a record. His jaw hardened. That was the moment he could have stopped. The deed could still have been challenged before Vale took possession. Sebastian could have listened, postponed the transfer, or allowed Alden to explain the settlement. Instead, he extended his hand toward her waist. Margaret stepped back, but his fingers had already closed around the brass lighthouse key hanging from her belt. It was worn smooth from 3 generations of use. Her father had pressed it into her palm during his final illness and made her promise that no Harrow ship would ever be guided by a dishonest flame. Sebastian removed it before the silent witnesses. Vale's men require access to the tower. Margaret stared at the key in his hand. If anything happens at that lighthouse, the responsibility will be yours. It already is. No, Sebastian. Authority and responsibility are not the same thing. You want the first and surrender the second whenever it becomes costly. Color rose beneath his collar. He dropped the key onto the deed. You will leave Gullhaven before sunset. By the time Margaret reached the island, Vale's occupation had begun. 6 armed men stood outside the lighthouse. 2 more carried boxes from the chart room, while the islanders watched from behind closed doors. The old keeper, Thomas Reed, had been dismissed without wages and ordered onto the mainland ferry. Margaret found him near the harbor, clutching his cap against his chest. They would not let me finish the evening inspection, he said. One of them asked which shutter faces the northern channel. Did you answer? I told him only the Duchess knows the full sequence. Margaret looked toward the tower. A man was measuring the western window, while another covered the signal register with a sheet of canvas. This was not harbor development. She approached the lighthouse steps, but Vale's agent blocked her path and demanded the key. When she refused, Sebastian's guards, men paid from her husband's estate, searched her coat and found it in the inner pocket where she had hidden it after quietly recovering it from the library desk. The humiliation was deliberate. The islanders watched as the key was taken from her a second time. Margaret was permitted one small case. She chose neither jewels nor gowns. She packed her father's brass dividers, a tide clock, 3 notebooks, and the leather chart case containing her newest coastal survey. At the harbor, little Samuel Reed clung to her sleeve. "Will they make us leave?" "Not tonight," she said, crouching to meet his frightened eyes. "Stay with your grandfather. Do not go near the tower, whatever you see." She boarded the final boat beside Thomas. As Gullhaven receded into the evening mist, the lighthouse beam swept across the water in its familiar white arc. Then it vanished. Thomas rose so quickly that the boat lurched. No keeper extinguishes the lamp at this hour. 3 minutes passed. The light returned bloodred. It crossed the sea once, paused, then crossed again, not toward the harbor entrance, but toward the deep water beyond Blackthorn Reef. Margaret counted the interval between the flashes. 2 long, 1 short, 2 long. An answering light appeared in the darkness. She pulled the leather chart case onto her lap and broke its clasp. Her survey of the Navy's concealed anchorage should have been inside. Instead, she found a blank sheet of paper. At the bottom, pressed into dark red wax, was Sebastian's ducal seal, and beneath his signature someone had written a single instruction: "Bring the fleet through before dawn." Margaret read the instruction twice. "Bring the fleet through before dawn." The boat rocked beneath her as Thomas Reed leaned closer. The old keeper's weathered face lost what little color remained in it. "That is His Grace's seal." "It is his seal," Margaret said. "That does not mean he wrote the message." But Sebastian's signature appeared genuine. She knew its hard downward strokes, the impatient crossing of the final letter, and the slight blot he always left when lifting his pen too quickly. Someone had either placed the document before him under a false explanation, or Sebastian had signed it without reading. Neither possibility absolved him. Margaret lifted the sheet toward the lantern. A pale watermark emerged inside the paper, a crowned falcon enclosed by a circle of thorns. Thomas inhaled sharply. Naval office paper, Admiralty dispatch stock. It could not have come from Harrow Hall. Such paper was numbered and guarded because it carried fleet orders, coastal defenses, and convoy routes. Margaret ran her thumb over the red wax. A thin grain of black sand clung to its edge. Gullhaven's northern shore was the only place along the coast where volcanic sand gathered beneath the cliffs. The message had been sealed on the island. She looked back. The crimson lighthouse beam crossed the water again. Far beyond Blackthorn Reef, the answering light moved closer. "Turn the boat around," Margaret ordered. The ferryman stared at her, as if she had asked him to sail into cannon fire. Vale's men said no vessel was to return before morning. "If that ship enters the passage marked on my stolen chart, it can reach the naval anchorage without being seen from the mainland batteries. And if we return," he said, "those guards will shoot us before we touch the pier." Margaret opened one of her notebooks and tore out a page. With her father's brass dividers, she measured the intervals between the red flashes. 2 long, 1 short, 2 long. After a pause, the sequence repeated. "They are not guiding the ship in yet," she said. They are confirming the channel. Thomas watched the distant light. How much time? The tide will not cover the reef sufficiently for another 3 hours. Margaret sketched the coastline, then marked a narrow inlet south of the main harbor. Take us to Widow's Cove. The cliff will hide our lantern. The ferryman hesitated until Thomas removed the silver watch from his pocket and pressed it into the man's palm. It belonged to my father, Thomas said. Bring us ashore alive, and it is yours. The boat turned. At Harrow Hall, Sebastian stood alone in the library, reading a letter that should have brought him triumph. Lord Vale regretted that urgent business had prevented him from attending the signing. Nevertheless, Sebastian's parliamentary nomination would be announced within the week. He was advised to avoid any public dispute with his wife until the transfer was beyond legal challenge. The final sentence troubled him. Any emotional accusation made by the Duchess must be treated as an attempt to conceal her misuse of Admiralty information. Sebastian folded the letter. Margaret had never misused a chart in her life. Even during their bitterest quarrels, he had never doubted her discipline at sea. The library door opened, and Vale's secretary entered without being announced. "Mr. Crow," Sebastian said coldly, "I dismissed you an hour ago. There is one additional matter." Crow placed a ledger on the desk. It recorded payments made from Gullhaven's harbor revenues over the previous 6 months. Several entries bore Margaret's initials. Sebastian scanned the amounts. "Payments to foreign merchants? Smugglers, Your Grace. We discovered the ledger in the Lighthouse office." The initials resembled Margaret's hand, but something about them felt wrong. She formed the letter M with narrow peaks. These were broad and careless. "Why was this not produced before I signed?" Crow's expression did not change. "Lord Vale hoped to spare Your Grace the pain of knowing the full extent of your wife's deception." Sebastian closed the ledger. "Leave it." Crow bowed, but before departing, his gaze shifted briefly toward the cabinet, where Sebastian kept his ducal seal. The cabinet stood open. Sebastian crossed the room in 3 strides. The seal was inside, but the black velvet beneath it was damp. When he lifted the handle, a few grains of dark sand fell onto his palm. A terrible memory surfaced. 3 days earlier, Vale had brought a stack of petitions for Sebastian to sign. Harbor improvements, customs appointments, requests for parliamentary review. Sebastian had signed every page while arguing with Margaret about the island. He had not read the final document. "Send a rider to Gullhaven," he ordered the footman outside. "No ship is to enter or leave the harbor. The island ferry has already departed, Your Grace. Then wake the Coast Guard." Sebastian turned back toward Crow, but the secretary had vanished. On Gullhaven, Margaret and Thomas climbed from Widow's Cove onto a shelf of wet rock. They followed an abandoned smuggler's path toward the lighthouse, staying beneath the cliff's shadow. Near the summit, Margaret heard voices. 2 of Vale's men were dragging a heavy wooden case toward the tower. A foreign word had been burned into its side. Fusées, signal rockets. Margaret waited until the men disappeared, then slipped into the empty keeper's cottage. The room had been searched. Drawers lay open, charts covered the floor, and the cupboard door hung from one hinge. Thomas knelt beside the cold fireplace. They took the signal registers. Not all of them. Margaret reached beneath the hearthstone and removed a narrow oilskin packet. Her father had hidden duplicate records there years ago, when coastal smugglers had tried to bribe him. Inside were 12 pages documenting every official lighthouse sequence. The red signal flashing outside appeared nowhere among them. A floorboard creaked behind her. Margaret turned. Samuel Reed stood in the doorway, trembling. Blood marked one sleeve of his shirt. They caught grandfather's assistant, he whispered. He heard them say, "The ship is not coming to attack the harbor." Margaret gripped his shoulders. "Then why is it coming?" Samuel looked toward the cliff, where the dark vessel was now visible between each sweep of crimson light. "It is coming to collect someone from Harrow House." "Who are they collecting?" Margaret asked. Samuel shook his head. Mr. Pike did not hear the name. One of Vale's men struck him before he could get closer. "Where is Pike now?" "In the old net shed." Thomas took the boy toward the back door, but Margaret caught his sleeve. "Keep Samuel hidden. Then find the ferryman and tell him to wait at Widow's Cove." "You mean to leave?" "I mean to make certain someone can." Once they were gone, Margaret studied the duplicate signal records. The sequence flashing from the lighthouse was absent, but the answering ship had used a familiar pattern: one long flash followed by 3 short. Her father had taught her that code 18 years earlier. It meant passenger prepared. Someone at Harrow House was expected to reach Gullhaven before dawn and board a foreign vessel. The plan required access to the island, her secret chart, Sebastian's seal, and knowledge of naval signaling. Lord Vale possessed all 4 because Sebastian had handed them to him. Margaret folded the records inside her coat and crept toward the lighthouse. The guards had gathered near the harbor, where horses were being led from a newly arrived barge. Vale's agent stood among them, consulting a pocket watch. "Crow will bring the package from Harrow House," he said. "No mistakes. Vale wants him aboard before the tide turns." Margaret froze. Crow was not merely Vale's secretary, he was the passenger. Then one of the men opened the wooden case, marked Fusées. Inside were signal rockets, red, green, and white, as well as several sealed leather dispatch bags bearing Admiralty markings. If Crow escaped with those documents, he could reveal British convoy routes, coastal batteries, and naval supply schedules. Margaret stepped backward. A loose stone shifted beneath her boot. The agent turned. "Who is there?" She ran. A pistol cracked behind her. The ball struck the cottage wall, spraying chips of stone across her shoulder. Margaret crossed the yard and reached the narrow path descending toward Widow's Cove, but 2 guards appeared below. She could not reach the boat. Instead, she climbed toward the lighthouse. The main door was locked. Margaret pulled her father's brass dividers from her pocket, forced one sharp point into the old side latch, and pushed until the rusted mechanism gave way. She entered and barred the door behind her. Heavy fists struck the wood almost immediately. Margaret climbed the spiral stairs. In the lantern room, a stranger operated the shutters, while the crimson lens turned before the flame. He reached for a knife. Margaret seized the iron lever controlling the lens and drove it into his wrist. The knife fell. He lunged, but she pulled the emergency release. A counterweight dropped through the central shaft, jerking the rotating mechanism sideways and throwing him against the railing. She took his knife and pointed it at his throat. "Open the western shutter." He laughed through clenched teeth. "The ship is already inside the reef." Margaret looked through the glass. The dark vessel had crossed into the hidden passage. Turning back would be nearly impossible until the tide rose again. She could not stop the ship, but she could change what its captain saw. Using the duplicate register, Margaret adjusted the shutters and removed the crimson lens. The beam became white again. 3 short flashes, 2 long, 1 short. The official naval signal for channel obstructed, hold position. The approaching vessel slowed. Below, Vale's men began battering the lighthouse door with a timber. Margaret sent a second sequence toward the mainland Coast Guard station. Armed seizure. Admiralty danger. A green rocket shot up from the harbor before she could finish. It burst above Gullhaven, casting the island in sickly light. The foreign vessel answered by raising more sail. "They changed the order," the captured signalman said. "The ship will enter whether the channel is marked or not." Margaret stared at the water. The tide was still too low. If the vessel continued, Blackthorn Reef would tear open its hull, killing its crew and destroying whatever evidence it carried. She needed to guide it into the only deep pocket inside the reef. The lighthouse door splintered below. At Harrow House, Sebastian had discovered that no Coast Guard riders remained in the stable. Crow had sent them away hours earlier, using an order bearing the Duke's own signature. Sebastian armed himself and rode for the coast with 2 servants. Halfway there, he found Mr. Alden's overturned carriage beside the road. The solicitor lay injured in the ditch. "Vale's men took my document case," Alden gasped. "They needed the original marriage settlement." "Why?" "Because Gullhaven was never yours to transfer." Sebastian's face tightened. "I was advised that the wording was uncertain." "There was nothing uncertain about it. The island belonged solely to Margaret. I tried to tell you in the library, but you would not let me speak." Sebastian looked toward the distant red light above Gullhaven. For the first time, he understood that losing his parliamentary seat might be the least of what he had done. Inside the lighthouse, Margaret locked the signalman to the railing and climbed onto the outer gallery. Wind pulled at her coat as she reached for the manual shutter chain. Vale's guards broke through the door below. She altered the beam one final time, guiding the foreign ship toward the deep water pocket. Then she saw a small boat approaching from the mainland. Crow stood at its bow. Beside him, bound and gagged, was Mr. Alden's young clerk, the only other witness who had read Margaret's original marriage settlement. Crow lifted a pistol and fired directly at the lighthouse glass. The pistol ball shattered the upper pane. Margaret dropped behind the iron housing as glass swept across the lantern room. Wind rushed through the opening, driving the flame sideways. Below, Vale's men climbed the stairs. Margaret released the captured signalman, then pressed his own knife into his hand. "Tell them I forced you to cooperate." "You did." "Then make it convincing." She pulled the maintenance hatch open and climbed onto the narrow exterior ladder. Another shot struck the railing as she descended through darkness. Halfway down, she swung onto a stone ledge and reached the keeper's cottage before the guards realized she had escaped. Thomas waited inside with Samuel and the wounded assistant, Pike. "The ship has stopped in the deep pocket," Margaret said, "but Crow is almost here." Pike struggled upright. "He has the original settlement. Did you see it?" He showed it to Vale's agent. There was another document with it, a list of naval officers who accepted bribes. Margaret understood. Crow was not fleeing with one secret. He carried evidence capable of destroying everyone involved in Vale's operation. "If he boards that ship, Vale can blame everything on him," she said. "If Crow dies before boarding, the truth dies with him." Outside, the guards shouted that the Duchess had escaped. Margaret sent Thomas and the boys toward Widow's Cove, then slipped downhill toward the harbor. Crow's boat had reached the pier. He dragged Alden's clerk ashore while 4 armed men surrounded them. The lighthouse signal was altered, the agent told him. Crow looked toward the tower. Margaret returned. "You said she had left the island. I underestimated her once. I will not do so again." Margaret hid behind stacked lobster pots. The clerk's hands were bound, but the rope around his ankles had loosened. She picked up a stone and threw it toward the warehouse. The guards turned at the sound. The clerk ran. Crow caught his coat, but Margaret emerged and drove her shoulder into Crow's side. Both men fell. The clerk scrambled behind the boats, while Crow's leather document case slid across the wet pier. Margaret seized it. A guard grabbed her wrist. She struck his face with the brass buckle, twisted free, and ran toward the southern path. Crow raised his pistol. "Stop, or I shoot the clerk." Margaret halted. The young man stood between two guards, blood running from his lip. Crow extended his hand. "The case. You need it to purchase your escape. I need it because your husband placed his name on documents that could hang him. Sebastian's recklessness does not make him your shield." "No," Crow said. "His ambition made him useful." A horse's hooves thundered beyond the harbor. Sebastian rode onto the pier with two servants behind him. He took in the armed guards, the foreign ship, and his wife holding Crow's case. "Release Margaret and the clerk," he ordered. Crow laughed. "You no longer command this island. I am still Duke of Harrow. And soon you will be remembered as the Duke who sold Britain's coastal defenses for a parliamentary seat." Sebastian dismounted. "I signed papers I had not read. That was my failure. But I never authorized treason. You authorized everything we required." Crow motioned to his men. They seized Sebastian. Margaret could have used the confusion to escape with the case, but the clerk remained trapped. She opened it and saw the original settlement, Admiralty dispatches, payment ledgers, and a folded chart covered with foreign annotations. She removed the settlement and concealed it inside her coat. Then she threw the case toward Crow. He released the clerk to catch it. Margaret pulled the young man away as Thomas and several island fishermen emerged from the darkness carrying boat hooks and oars. Outnumbered, Vale's guards retreated toward the pier with Sebastian as their prisoner. Crow searched the case. "The settlement is missing." Margaret stepped backward, placing herself between him and the islanders. Crow pressed his pistol beneath Sebastian's jaw. "Give it to me, Duchess, or your husband dies for the island he stole from you." Margaret met Sebastian's eyes. For the first time that night, he had no order to give her. Margaret lowered the spyglass. Samuel had been taken from the keeper's cottage during the fighting. Lord Vale held the boy with one arm while smoke spread across the ship's stern. "He wants us aboard," Sebastian said. "He wants me aboard," Margaret corrected. "I am the only person who can guide that ship off the reef." She chose a fishing boat and ordered Thomas to remain behind. Sebastian stepped in after her. "I told you that I command this rescue. I heard you. Then obey me." "No." He took the oars. "But I will follow your orders." Margaret had no time to argue. They crossed the channel beneath falling ash. When their boat reached the damaged vessel, Crow lowered a rope ladder. Sebastian climbed first, drawing the guard's attention, while Margaret slipped a small mariner's blade into her sleeve. Vale waited beside the mainmast. "Give Crow the corrected route," he said, tightening his grip on Samuel. "Then you may take the boy. The fire will reach your powder before we clear the reef. Then work quickly." Margaret approached the chart table. Her stolen survey lay open beneath a compass. Several Admiralty dispatch bags were stacked beside it. Crow handed her a pencil. She marked a route leading west. He studied it. "This passes close to the outer ridge. It is the only water deep enough." That was true, but she had omitted the current that would push the vessel toward open sea once its anchor line was cut. Sebastian moved nearer to Samuel. Vale noticed. "One more step, Harrow, and the child dies." Margaret dropped the pencil. As Vale glanced toward her, Samuel stamped hard on his foot and twisted free. Sebastian seized the boy and shielded him while a guard fired. The ball struck Sebastian's upper arm. Margaret drew her blade and cut the rope holding the damaged boom. The heavy timber swung across the deck, knocking two guards down and forcing Vale away from the rail. "Take Samuel to the boat," she shouted. Sebastian obeyed. Crow grabbed the Admiralty bags and ran toward the stern. Margaret followed him through the smoke. He tossed one bag into Vale's waiting launch, but she caught the second before he could throw it. Crow struck her across the face. She fell against the rail, still gripping the evidence. "You should have stayed dispossessed," he said. A deep crack sounded below deck. The powder hold was beginning to burn. Margaret kicked the chart table into Crow's knees and ran. She reached the fishing boat as Sebastian cut the ship's anchor line. The rising current caught the vessel exactly as she had predicted. It slid away from Gullhaven's harbor, carrying Vale, Crow, and the remaining conspirators toward open water. Moments later, the powder hold exploded. The blast tore through the stern and threw flame high above the sea. Margaret shielded Samuel as debris struck the water around them. When the smoke cleared, the ship was sinking beyond the reef. Sebastian, pale from blood loss, looked at the dispatch bag in Margaret's hands. "Is that enough to expose Vale?" She opened it. Inside was a payment ledger, the stolen naval chart, and dozens of sealed orders carrying Sebastian's signature. But the final document was different. It named Duchess Margaret Harrow as the leader of the entire conspiracy and ordered her arrest for treason at sunrise. Margaret examined the arrest order beneath the lighthouse lamp. The document carried Sebastian's seal and signature, but its date was 3 days old, before he had transferred Gullhaven to Vale. "You signed this before tonight," she said. Sebastian sat at the keeper's table, while Thomas bound his wounded arm. His face tightened as he read it. "Vale told me it authorized an inquiry into missing harbor revenue. You signed an order without reading the charge or the accused." "Yes." The simplicity of his admission startled her more than an excuse would have. Sebastian looked at the islanders gathered inside the cottage. "I wanted Vale's support so badly that I treated every objection as an attack on my ambition," Margaret warned me. Alden tried to speak. I silenced them both. Margaret folded the document. "That confession will not prevent my arrest." At sunrise, an Admiralty cutter entered Gullhaven harbor. Captain Henry Mercer came ashore with 12 Marines and a warrant identical to the document in Margaret's hands. He found her waiting beside the damaged lighthouse. "Duchess Margaret Harrow," he announced, "you are accused of providing protected charts and coastal signals to a foreign power." "I will come willingly," Margaret said, "after you inspect the evidence recovered from that ship." Mercer looked toward the wreck beyond the reef. "Lord Vale has already submitted evidence against you. Lord Vale was aboard the foreign vessel. He claims he boarded it to recover stolen dispatches." Sebastian stepped forward. "That is a lie." The captain's expression cooled. "Your signature appears on the authorization, Your Grace." "It does. I signed it through negligence and ambition. My wife did not." Mercer hesitated, then allowed Margaret to open the recovered bag. She showed him the payment ledger, the false harbor accounts, and the incomplete naval chart. The captain compared the chart with one of Margaret's official surveys. "The markings are in her hand," he said. "The coastline is," Margaret replied. "The foreign annotations are not. Examine the depth figures." Mercer bent closer. Every number Margaret wrote contained a narrow open 4, a habit learned from her father. The altered depths used closed 4s and heavier ink. "The chart was changed after leaving my possession," she said, "and those alterations guided the ship onto Blackthorn Reef." A Marine hurried from the harbor, carrying debris recovered near the wreck. Among it was a metal dispatch box, scorched but still locked. The box bore Lord Vale's crest. Mercer ordered it opened. Inside were letters addressed to Crow, receipts for foreign gold, and lists of naval officers marked as either purchased or replaceable. But the final letter carried no signature, only instructions to frame Margaret and use Sebastian's political ambitions to obtain Gullhaven. "It proves Vale's involvement," Mercer said, "not who commanded him." Margaret studied the paper. The crowned falcon watermark matched the blank sheet found in her chart case. She held it over the lamp. A second message appeared between the lines, written in invisible ink. Heat turned the words brown. "Once Harrow signs the transfer, remove Vale and Crow. The island will pass to our true patron." Sebastian stared at it. Vale was never intended to keep Gullhaven. "No," Margaret said. "He was another disposable accomplice." A gunshot sounded from the harbor. The Marines ran toward the pier. A fishing boat had emerged from the morning fog. Crow lay wounded inside it, while Lord Vale held a pistol against his back. Their launch had survived the explosion. Vale raised both hands when the Marines surrounded him. "I request the protection of the Crown," he called. "I can identify the person who planned everything." Captain Mercer ordered him searched. Vale surrendered a sealed letter bearing the insignia of the Home Office. He smiled at Sebastian. "You wanted a seat in Parliament, Harrow. You never asked whose seat you were meant to replace." Margaret broke the seal. The letter named their true patron, Sir Roland Ashford, the minister responsible for coastal defense, and the man scheduled to arrive at Gullhaven that afternoon to preside over Margaret's arrest. At the bottom was a final instruction. If Margaret produced evidence, the lighthouse and everyone inside it were to be destroyed before the inquiry began. Margaret looked toward the tower. From its lower storeroom came the unmistakable smell of gunpowder. Margaret ran toward the lighthouse storeroom. Captain Mercer ordered the Marines to evacuate the tower, but she stopped at the threshold. The gunpowder had been packed inside 6 barrels beneath the spiral staircase. A thin trail of powder crossed the floor and disappeared through a drainage opening toward the cliffs. "There is a fuse outside," she said. "Someone is waiting to ignite it." Mercer sent 4 Marines around the tower. Margaret inspected the barrels without touching them. Their lids carried the same crowned falcon mark as the Admiralty paper. Sir Roland had used government stores to prepare the explosion, confident that his position would protect him from suspicion. Sebastian entered behind her. "You should leave. So should you. This was caused by my decisions, and these are my people standing outside." She found a rope pulley once used to raise lamp oil to the upper chamber. With Thomas and the Marines, she attached each barrel and lowered it through a rear window onto the rocks below. The work was slow. Every scrape of wood against stone sounded like the beginning of an explosion. They had removed 5 barrels when a pistol fired outside. One of Sir Roland's agents had been hiding beneath the cliff path. The Marines captured him, but not before he dropped a burning taper onto the powder trail. Flame raced toward the lighthouse. Sebastian seized a bucket, but Margaret stopped him. Water would not reach the fire in time. She pulled the emergency shutter chain from the wall and threw its heavy iron end through the window. It struck the burning trail and scattered the loose powder across the wet rocks. The flame died less than 3 feet from the final barrel. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Margaret lifted the last barrel herself. By noon, the lighthouse courtyard had become an improvised court of inquiry. Captain Mercer assembled the Marines, island families, surviving sailors, and the captured conspirators. Vale and Crow were placed under guard beside the recovered evidence. A government vessel appeared beyond the harbor. Sir Roland Ashford arrived wearing a dark official coat, accompanied by clerks and armed officers. He stepped ashore as though the island already belonged to him. "I am here to arrest Duchess Margaret Harrow," he announced. Captain Mercer blocked his path. "The circumstances have changed." Sir Rowland's gaze moved to the surviving dispatch box. For the first time, his confidence faltered. Margaret came forward carrying the altered chart and the secret letter. "You plan to destroy this lighthouse," she said, "along with every witness to the false signals." A desperate accusation from a woman facing treason charges. She held up the arrest order. "This carries my husband's signature, but you supplied the false accusation. Crow's ledger records payment to the clerk who drafted it. Your husband signed it willingly." "Yes," Margaret said. "That is why he will answer for his own conduct, but his guilt does not erase yours." A murmur passed through the islanders. Sebastian stepped beside her. His wounded arm was bound against his chest. "Duchess Harrow warned me that the transfer endangered the coast," he said. "I ignored her. I signed documents I had not read because Sir Rowland promised me influence in Parliament. I then used my authority to remove my wife from her lawful property." Sir Rowland smiled thinly. "A wounded husband will confess to anything to save his wife." "I am not saving her," Sebastian replied. "She saved this island despite me." Margaret placed Vale's letter over a lantern. The invisible instructions appeared again. Captain Mercer read them aloud, including the order to eliminate Vale, Crow, and Margaret once the transfer was complete. Vale turned toward Sir Rowland. "You promised me Gullhaven. I promised nothing in my own hand." "That is true," Margaret said. "So I found your handwriting elsewhere." She opened the duplicate lighthouse register. On the night Sir Rowland had visited Gullhaven 6 months earlier, he had signed the inspection page personally. The unusual capital R and the hooked final D matched the secret instructions exactly. Crow began to laugh. "You told us no one would examine the lighthouse books." Sir Rowland's face changed. Captain Mercer ordered the minister arrested. His officers hesitated, uncertain whether a naval captain had authority over a senior government official. Sir Rowland used that instant to seize Samuel from the edge of the crowd. He drew a small pistol and retreated toward his waiting vessel. "Stand aside, or the boy dies." Margaret watched the tide beneath the pier. Sir Rowland's vessel sat low in the water, its keel dangerously close to the ridge exposed during the falling tide. She raised one hand to stop the Marines, then she addressed the ship's captain. "If you leave now, you will strike the reef before reaching open water." Sir Rowland dragged Samuel aboard. "She is lying." The captain looked from Margaret to the whitening waves over Blackthorn Reef. Sir Rowland pressed the pistol against Samuel's head and ordered the sails raised. The vessel pulled away from the pier. Margaret turned toward the lighthouse, where the repaired white beam waited behind its shutters. "He thinks the lighthouse belongs to him," she said. "Let us show him who commands it." Margaret climbed to the lantern room and took control of the shutters. Sir Rowland's vessel was approaching the channel entrance. Its captain watched the lighthouse beam, waiting for a safe route. Margaret sent 3 short flashes westward. "Reef exposed. Turn south." The captain began altering course. Sir Rowland struck him and seized the wheel. He forced the vessel north, directly toward the shallow ridge. Samuel struggled in his grasp. "Can you guide Captain Mercer's cutter beside them?" Sebastian asked. "Not through the same channel. There is another passage east of the reef, but it is barely wide enough." "Show me." Margaret drew the route on a scrap of paper. Sebastian carried it to Mercer, who immediately ordered his Marines aboard the cutter. Margaret continued signaling from the tower, directing Mercer through the eastern passage, while Sir Rowland's vessel moved toward the exposed stones. When the two ships were close enough, the Marines threw grappling lines across the gap. Sir Rowland dragged Samuel toward the stern. "Come closer, and I shoot him." Margaret changed the lighthouse signal. One long, two short. Samuel looked toward the tower. His grandfather had taught him that simple sequence years earlier. Drop low. The boy threw himself flat. Captain Mercer fired. The shot struck the pistol from Sir Rowland's hand. Marines crossed the grappling lines and overwhelmed his remaining guards. Sir Rowland tried to leap into the sea, but Sebastian caught him by the coat. For one furious moment, Margaret feared her husband would throw the minister onto the reef. Instead, Sebastian pulled him back onto the deck. "You will stand before every person whose life you tried to destroy," he said. "Death would spare you that." By evening, Sir Rowland, Vale, and Crow were confined aboard the Admiralty cutter. The evidence was catalogued in front of independent witnesses. The original settlement was recovered from Mr. Alden's office ledger and delivered to Gullhaven under Marine Guard. It confirmed that the island belonged solely to Margaret. Captain Mercer formally withdrew her arrest warrant. But Margaret refused a private declaration of innocence. "The accusation was made before my household, the Admiralty, and the islanders," she said. "The correction will be made before them as well." 3 days later, the public inquiry began in the Gullhaven warehouse. Naval officers, magistrates, tenants, fishermen, and journalists filled the room. Margaret stood at the central table with her charts, signal registers, the altered arrest order, and the recovered payment ledger. She explained how Sir Rowland had targeted Gullhaven because its hidden channel offered access to the naval anchorage. Vale was promised ownership of the island. Crow forged accounts and inserted false documents among Sebastian's petitions. Bribed agents altered the lighthouse and stole Margaret's chart. The scheme could proceed only after Sebastian removed her authority and transferred the island. When Margaret finished, Captain Mercer called Sebastian to testify. The Duke stood before the people he had failed. "No one forced me to distrust my wife," he said. "Sir Rowland exploited my ambition, but the choice was mine. Margaret warned me that the transfer was unlawful and dangerous. I silenced her, took her key, removed her from her inheritance, and signed papers without reading them because I wanted political power." He turned toward Margaret. "I publicly treated your knowledge as interference, and your property as mine to spend. I will not ask you to soften those facts for my sake." Sir Rowland was charged with treason, theft of protected documents, conspiracy, attempted murder, and kidnapping. Vale and Crow faced charges for espionage, forgery, unlawful seizure, and armed violence. Their cooperation would be considered, but neither escaped imprisonment or confiscation of illicit assets. Sebastian's parliamentary nomination was withdrawn. The Crown suspended his authority over the coastal estates pending a formal review. Then he presented a signed deed renouncing every claim to Gullhaven, its harbor income, and Margaret's future cartographic work. "This does not repay what I took," he said. "It merely returns what was never mine." Margaret accepted the deed, but gave him no forgiveness. After the inquiry, she climbed the lighthouse alone. The shattered glass had been replaced, and the beam once again crossed the water in a clear white arc. Sebastian waited below with a packed traveling case. "I have arranged to leave Harrow House," he said when she descended. "The house and its income will remain available to you while our separation is settled. You once ordered me off my own island before sunset. I remember. Now I leave because you should not have to surrender another home to escape me." Margaret looked at the man she had once loved, then at the brass lighthouse key resting in her palm. Before she could answer, Captain Mercer approached with a royal dispatch. The Admiralty was offering Margaret permanent authority over Gullhaven's coastal station, but accepting it required her to make one final choice: remain Duchess of Harrow, or petition the Crown for a legal separation that would end Sebastian's power over her life. Margaret accepted the Admiralty appointment. On the same morning, she instructed Mr. Alden to petition the Crown for a formal separation from Sebastian. She made both decisions at the Lighthouse table, where her father had once taught her to chart the tides. Her restored marriage settlement lay beside the Admiralty Commission, but she signed the commission first. For years, Margaret's work had survived only because powerful men found it useful while refusing to credit its author. That arrangement was over. The Crown formally restored Gullhaven Island, its harbor revenues, cottages, fishing rights, and lighthouse to her sole control. No future husband, trustee, or estate steward could sell or mortgage it without her written consent. The Admiralty also cleared her name publicly. Notices were sent to every office that had received the false treason accusation. Her corrected charts were issued under her full name: Margaret Harrow, Coastal Surveyor of Gullhaven Station. Sir Rowland Ashford was removed from office and tried for treason, conspiracy, kidnapping, theft of protected documents, and attempted murder. His estates were seized to compensate the Crown and the families endangered by his scheme. Lord Vale surrendered his political influence and property acquired through illegal transactions. His testimony reduced the severity of his sentence, but did not save him from imprisonment. Crow's forged ledgers, false arrest order, stolen dispatches, and attempted escape left him with no such protection. He was convicted of espionage, forgery, and armed conspiracy. The bribed lighthouse agents and customs officers were dismissed and prosecuted according to their roles. Those who cooperated early received lesser sentences. Those who had used violence did not. Sebastian's reckoning was different. He had not designed the conspiracy, but he had made it possible. He had transferred property that was not his, removed its rightful protector, ignored legal warnings, surrendered access to naval charts, and signed accusations against his wife without reading them. The Crown permanently withdrew his parliamentary nomination. He lost his authority over the coastal estates and was required to repay every expense Gullhaven had suffered during Vale's occupation. At Margaret's insistence, the money did not pass through her hands. It funded new fishing boats, repairs to the harbor wall, compensation for injured islanders, and a pension for Thomas Reed. Sebastian also sold the London townhouse he had purchased in anticipation of his political career. The proceeds restored the harbor trust he had allowed Vale to drain. None of those acts purchased Margaret's forgiveness. At the final public hearing, Sebastian stood before the islanders once more. "I told myself that I was securing my family's future," he said. "In truth, I wanted admiration. When my wife's knowledge challenged my decision, I treated her intelligence as disobedience. I took her key, expelled her from her island, and placed her name beneath a charge of treason because reading carefully seemed less important than gaining power." He looked directly at Margaret, but did not approach her. "She owes me no reconciliation. Whatever good I do now must be done without expecting her return." The legal separation was granted months later. Margaret retained her title by courtesy, but Sebastian held no claim over her residence, income, work, correspondence, or decisions. She chose to live permanently on Gullhaven, in the keeper's house facing the sea. Sebastian moved to a smaller inland estate. He continued paying restitution and testified in every related prosecution. He wrote to Margaret only when legal or financial matters required it, never asking her to come back. 1 year after the false red signal appeared over Blackthorn Reef, the rebuilt lighthouse opened. Captain Mercer attended on behalf of the Admiralty. Thomas, officially appointed senior keeper, stood beside Samuel at the lantern controls. The islanders crowded the courtyard, while Margaret unveiled a brass plaque honoring those who had protected the harbor. Sebastian remained at the edge of the gathering. Margaret approached him after the ceremony. "The final compensation reached Pike's family," he said, "and the harbor trust is fully restored. I received the accounts." He nodded. "Then there is nothing else you require from me. There is one thing." He looked at her, but she saw no expectation in his face. "Continue telling the truth," she said, "especially when it costs you." "I will." That was all. No promise of renewed love passed between them. Margaret could acknowledge his accountability without surrendering the freedom she had recovered. Remorse had changed Sebastian, but it could not erase the moment he chose ambition over her safety, property, and voice. At sunset, Margaret climbed the lighthouse alone. A naval convoy waited beyond the reef for her signal. She checked the tide clock, consulted the chart bearing her name, and opened the western shutter. The clear white beam swept across the darkening sea. 1 year earlier, Sebastian had taken the brass key from her before witnesses and ordered her away from her own island. Now, Margaret turned that same key in the lantern mechanism. The ships changed course at her command, and this time no one stood behind her claiming the light.